Okay, good evening, everyone. It is a pleasure. It's an honor to see so many people here. I think it speaks volumes about this community. And for me personally, I did this last year. Some of the there's some nods here in the crowd. But I feel like last year I was just off the boat. And this year I've been here. I've been a year and a half. I'm a veteran. I'm an old timer here, in Boca standards. So it's good to look around the room, know people, see familiar faces, and to be back here, sharing some of our history, sharing some ideas again with you this evening. So this evening is the beginning of a 4-part series. Let's just see why this is. Go. A 4-part series that will run in consecutive weeks. I think we have 3 weeks in a row, and then we take one break for Hanukkah, and we finish the week after Hanukkah. And the goal, last year we spoke a lot about the making of modern Jewish history as it emerged from Western Europe. Our goal this year is to focus on the world of Eastern Europe. We're not going to be able in 4 lectures to tell the whole story of what emerges over the course of the 18th and 19th centuries, the world of Chasidus, the world of what is known as the Yeshiva movement. We simply can't do it in the course of 4 lectures. So we're going to take snippets, we're going to take pieces of it. We're going to begin with sort of a large overview, and then we're going to focus in on a few places that I think are pretty interesting. So we're going to set today, we're going to set the stage. We're going to place everything we're going to talk about over the next month into context. That's our goal for today. Next week, we will talk about the rise of Hasidus with a focus on its spread. Why does it become the most successful movement within traditional Judaism, probably since the destruction of the second Beis Hamikdash? It spreads and spreads like wildfire to the point where till today, it still has a very deep impression on the world of traditional Judaism, both within circles who clearly call themselves part of the Hasidic world, and for many of us who live outside the Hasidic world, we've been touched by it in so many different ways. And so our question in our lecture number 2 is going to be, why? Why did this spread the way it did? What was the secret to the success? And of course, in order to do that, we're going to have to understand what Hasidus is and where it came from. In lecture number 3, we're going to take a look here, even in a more narrow sense, at one of the most fascinating people in the history of our people, the Vilna Gaon, who is important to the story, of course, because he is the leadership of the opposition to Hasidus. But he is a man who, over the course of the years, so much has become mixed and intermingled between who he really was and what he really did, right? And the myth, the legends that have emerged around him. And so the goal for lecture number 3 is to understand a little bit about the Vilna Gaon, and then begin to understand why, right, some of the myths that surround the Vilna Gaon have emerged the way that they have. And the last lecture is one that I've been giving over the years, and I feel kind of passionate about it, because there are so many places and so many people today who you can go to who will teach you about Chasidim and Misnagdim, about the world of Hasidus and the world of the yeshiva world, and without getting into any political overtones of any sort, there's just something really interesting about the fact that when I say to you Chasidim and Misnagdim, I am virtually certain that if you were to conjure an image in your mind, it would be an image of a man. It's just an interesting thing, right? Because half the population, even back then, were women, right? So it's just a fascinating thing that when we talk about this period of time and the impact that it had on the Jewish world, we almost immediately gravitate to, because we know far more, right, about what this looked like on the lives of men. So in the last of our lecture series, we're going to try and drill down a little bit into what did this look like for women? What was the impact of these two movements on the lives of Jewish women? So that's the series. That's what's to come over the course of the next month. Before we dig in, though, no, I want to name the perhaps an elephant in the room. And the elephant that I'm referring to goes something like this. We're about to talk about the creation, the innovation, the emergence of a movement called Hasidus and its opposition, which ultimately gave rise to another movement we call the Yeshiva movement today. The elephant in the room is that we're not talking about somebody else's history here. We're talking about our history. The elephant in the room is that when we talk about Hasidus or the Yeshiva movement, there are people sitting in this room today for whom this is me. This is part of my heritage, my identity. We're not just talking about something in a sample in a petri dish somewhere that we can take apart. That we're talking about who I am, who my family is, where I come from, what I believe in, how I identify today. Now, why is that challenging? It's not necessarily challenging. In fact, we often gravitate towards understanding the history of our own people, right? That's a pretty natural thing to do. It's pretty interesting for us to understand where we came from. The challenge sometimes emerges in the fact that although many of us may identify with one side of this issue or the other, one group of these people or the other, all of us identify as traditional Jews. Now, as traditional Jews, a big part of our identity is the idea of Masorah, that we live in a way that we have lived for hundreds, if not thousands of years. That's core to what it means to be a traditional Jew. So now when we go and we study our history, history is interested in things that are new, right? In things that emerge, in things that were different than what came before. And sometimes that's a little bit unsettling for people who have, like myself, an identity as a traditional Jew, as somebody who is the bearer of a Masorah that's been the same for hundreds of years, to then go back and say, wait a minute, maybe some of what I'm doing emerged from some certain place under some certain circumstances at a certain point in history, can feel a little bit unsettling at times. Even though we know in our minds, right, we know that David HaMelech never went to a Farbrengen. We know that, right? And we know that the Rambam for sure didn't wear a black hat. We know and he never learned the mirror. We know that, right, rationally, but there's still something that's a little unsettling, right, about the fact that there are pieces of us that emerged at certain points, right, over the course of history. So what I wanted to start with is a little chakira. Perhaps I'm showing my own cards too far, but this is the way that I often like to think about this. Ooh, you can't see it here. About this question. This says Bria Chadasha, and that's the question. The question is there Bria? Are there new things that are created in history? Are there things that come that didn't happen, that didn't emerge, that didn't exist before? And I like to frame the way we think about this, and again, it helps me, at least, as somebody who clearly identifies as a traditional Torah observant Jew. I like to use the following categorization. When we talk about Bria, creation of things, to borrow rabbinic terms that were borrowed from the Greeks, we have two different types of Bria. We have Bria Yesh Me'ayin, and we have Bria Yesh Me'yesh. Right? Bria Yesh Me'ayin, creation ex nihilo, only God does that. Only God creates things that didn't exist at all before. In history, when we say something is new, something is an innovation, something emerges that didn't exist before, we mean the second kind. We mean bria yesh meyesh, meaning it's an emergence from pre-existing trends, from things that already existed. Nothing happens in a vacuum. History doesn't unfold in a vacuum, ever. Which is why it's always hard to know where to start any course on history, because it always depends on what came before. So it's always important for me, right, to remind myself, as much as we're talking about things that are new and things that are different, right, and things that will change the way, right, traditional Jews live their lives, the context is it's bria yesh meyesh. There were clearly antecedents to all this. It didn't come out of nowhere. It came out of somewhere. And so much of what we're going to do in our lecture today is to begin to talk about, where did some of these things begin? Where did they emerge from? Let's set the context in which to put this story. So let's begin with the geography. Where does our story happen? So in the traditional telling of the story, right, the story happens in Poland and Lithuania, right? In Poland and Lithuania. Except that when we as Jews say Poland and Lithuania, we don't exactly mean what today Google Maps would identify as Poland and Lithuania. The area that we're talking about spans this entire region, right? What is today Poland, much of the Ukraine, almost all of the country of Belarus, and almost all of the country of Lithuania. In fact, in the time that we're talking about, so we're going back here to the 17th, right, or the 16th and 17th century, this is the largest country in Europe. It is the largest country, it is the largest single political entity. It's larger than France, England, Spain. It is the largest country in all of Europe, and it is known as the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And it consists of two major areas. So this darker area up here, that's Lithuania, right? And this lighter area down here is Poland. Poland was often known by various regions, Greater Poland, Lesser Poland, Galicia, Volhynia, Podolia. These are these areas, each of these areas cut up into those various sections, but generally speaking, we're talking about an area known as the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Now, when did Jews get to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth? Somewhere in the 12th or 13th century is when Jews begin to arrive in significant numbers to this area. And where did they come from? So they came largely from Western Europe, from these areas over here. Right? And why did they come? Well, largely because of expulsions. We were kicked out. Right? We were kicked out of much of Western Europe over the course of the first, right, from the year 1000, right, to the year 1500. We're all familiar with the expulsion of Jews from Spain, right, in 1492, which is almost the last of the expulsions. Expulsions have been happening for 500 years in Western Europe on a smaller scale generally. They were generally more regional, but we were forced to move from one place to the other, whether it was due to crusades early on, whether in the middle of the 14th century due to the Black Death, and Jews were accused of having been behind the spread of that disease. Very often, local expulsions are a result of the fact that a very, very small number of Jews found a living in the money lending industry, which is a lecture for another time. A small number, but they made up a very large number, very large percentage of the money lending industry. Okay? Small number of Jews, but make up a large percentage of this industry. The nobility depended on Jews to lend money, particularly when they wanted to go to war. Right? They needed resources in a place far away. Jews were best suited to do that for them, to be able to get them. Jews had a network. Right? They could talk to other Jews in other places. They had a language in common. So in a time where you didn't have secure mail, right, Jews could get messages to each other. They trusted each other. They could lend money in a place that was a good distance away. So so money lending lent itself right, to Jews for a variety of different reasons. What does this have to do with the migration to Poland? Well, simply because if you become too indebted to the local Jew, the best way to get rid of your debt is get rid of the Jews, right? And then you no longer have a debt. So Jews are being forced out of much of this area beginning in the 12th century, but will make their way into this area of Lithuania and Poland. Now, why? Why do they land up there? And not only why do they land up there, but why does Poland land up being such a good home for Jews for so long? Sorry. So let's do a bit of a thought experiment first. Can we do this? We're all adults in the room. Close your eyes for a second. Just picture Poland.
Which century?
Just Poland. All right, good. Open your eyes. Somebody want to share what they saw? What did it look like? What did it look like? Shtetl. Okay. What does Shtetl look like? Bunch of Chasidim. Okay. Farmland. Small villages. A ghetto. Okay, good. Huh? Cold. Cold, right? What color is it? Gray, right? How many people had a vision of gray, right? Right? Okay. So I would do this with my college students, right, every year, and we'd get the same thing. Like, it's gray, it's dark, it's cold. Right? I'd have to explain to them sometimes that just because the photography was black and white doesn't mean the people were actual, right? But almost inevitably, right, the picture is something very different than that. Or that. Or that. But that's Poland, Lithuania, and the Ukraine. It is an incredibly rich area, natural resources. This is Me'inyane de Yoma, right? The rich resources of this area is coming up it's in our news feeds today. Why? Ukraine, exactly. Ukraine supplies 10% of the world's wheat, right? And I think 13% of the world's barley. Because this is extremely fertile, rich land. Some of it is farmland, some of it is dense forest. Right? It's an extremely rich with natural resources, right? And quite beautiful, right? In many places. Okay, hold that thought, because that's going to become important, right? As we tell this story. Okay. The second important thing to understand is that the system, the structure of economic and social life and political life in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was different than that of much of Western Europe. This is a traditional graphic used to explain the structure of medieval life in much of Europe. And the structure goes something like this. You've got a king who sits on the top of the pyramid. Then you have a nobility, a noble class. These are people who were born into the nobility. Many of them are landholders. The nobility has to be protected. They are protected by knights. So knights generally consist of people born to noble birth, right, but who do not actually own land. Either their father didn't like them very much, right, or they ran into debts or other reasons, and they land up without land. But they aren't going to become serfs. They become knights, or they become priests. Exactly, clergy, right? Good. So you have the king on the top. The king is rules completely in most of these countries. They give out lands to the nobility and they take them away. So the history of medieval Europe is that families rise and families fall depending on their in or outs, right, with the local monarch. And then below this class of lords and knights, you have your peasantry. They're born peasants, they die peasants, they work the land. They're pretty much owned by the nobility on whose land, right, they were born and to whom they owe just about everything. That is much of Western Europe. The way life is arranged is often around what is known as a manor, right? So a manor would have the house of the nobleman on the manor, would have a church, of course, where people would come to pray. Then you had your peasantry, most of whom worked the fields, some of whom would engage in various types of labor that were necessary to keep the manor afloat. Poland, Lithuania was different in two very critical ways. Number one, the size of the lands owned by the nobility in Poland were massive. These lands, by the way, were known as latifundia. Latifundia means these tremendous estates, right, owned by the nobility. And the wording here doesn't matter. Just look at the colors, right? And you can see the size of some of these. I mean, this is basically the size of Rhode Island, right? These are massive, massive tracts of land. And you will see also that they are not necessarily contiguous, right? So the same color means it was owned by the same noble family, right? But they may dot various parts of the country and aren't necessarily about one another. So you have orange here, but you have orange here, and you have orange out here, and a little bit down here, right? You've got red spread throughout this area over here. So that's number one. The land's holdings are massive, only held by about 1% of 10% of the nobility, I believe, were held almost all of the lands in Poland, and they weren't contiguous with one another. Now, add to that these lands were also extremely rich in natural resources. They produced a tremendous amount. So the nobility in the Poland and Lithuania had a challenge, because noblemen, they don't get into the business of running your lands. Right? That's not a very noble thing to do. Right? So they had a challenge because it was hard for them to manage lands that were so vast, that weren't necessarily contiguous, and that actually produced often more than what their lands actually needed themselves. They were already in the export trade, right? By the 16th, 15th, and 16th century, they were producing more, right, than they needed to sustain themselves. Right? So they needed help running their estates. And so a system was created known as the arenda, right, which were a system of leases. And arenda leases could look in a bunch of different ways, but initially an arenda was, I will lease out this property to you. So take this little piece of blue over here. I'm living here. So I'm gonna lease this blue, right, land out to somebody else who's gonna manage it for me. Okay. But at a certain point, they became far more complex than that. Right? Because it became, I need sub-arenda holders who are going to not just take controls of certain parts of land, but perhaps certain industries within the land. So you can now hold an arenda on the grain in this particular area. That way I'll be sure that the grain is going to be tended to, right? And that the excess is going to be sold for a good profit, a good margin, right? By putting somebody actually in charge of those things. So the system that emerges in Poland looks something like this. Beginning at the top, there is a king in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, but that king is elected by the nobility. Not only is Poland the largest country in Europe at the time, but it is by far the most progressive and liberal country in Europe at the time. The king holds very little power, whereas in other countries, the nobility are completely dependent on the king. In Poland and Lithuania, the king is completely dependent on the nobility. The nobility elect the king. The nobility themselves in their lands have absolute power. They can do what they want. Now, to manage these vast estates, and vast estates which are far more stable, right, than they are in much of the rest of Western Europe, where a new king can take your lands away, right, with the bat of an eye. In Poland, these lands are pretty much there to stay, and so they need to be managed. So they would lease out their lands in one of these fashions. Either they would, let's start on this side, right? A nobleman may give an arrendator, that's a leaseholder, the entire latifundia, that entire estate. You go and manage it, you do with it what you want, you pay me, and we're good. Or right, they may give it to a latifundia who then, right, sorry, they may give the latifundia to an arrendator who then is going to sublease the various industries on their land. The grain industry is going to go to this person, the timber industry is going to go to that person, so on and so forth. Or they may have a bunch of both. The king himself owned land, and they too had arrendators either of the industry type or of the latifundia type, and each of these may then have sub-arrendators, right, who lease from them. And below this system of arrendators and sub-arrendators, or arrendators of latifundia and arrendators of industries and arrendators and sub-arrendators is your peasantry. Question is, who's going to run these things? Who's going to do that? What are your choices? Who's ready to manage a massive estate or the grain industry? Well, what are your choices? Your choices are peasantry. Not a great choice. They're illiterate, right? They can't do math generally, right? You don't want them managing an estate the size of Rhode Island. Okay, so then there's the nobility. Well, what nobility would you put into such a position? If the person is a landholder themselves, they're not going to want to run your estates. They are going to want to enjoy the life of a nobleman and release out their own estates. So that leaves noblemen, people born into noble birth, who don't own land. Well, what's the problem of putting them into this position? Yeah, jealousy. I mean, that's a real risk, right? A real risk you're taking by putting a different nobleman in between you and your peasantry, right? Then the allegiance goes to that noble that noble person. All they have to do is arm some of the peasantry, right? And ultimately take your lands away from you. So that was extremely dangerous. So who made the perfect fit? Jews, particularly from money lending families from Western Europe, who are now looking for a place to go. They have experience, right, managing things, working with money. They're no threat to anybody. Right? They're never going to become nobility. And they're not peasantry. They fit perfectly into this system. Poland and Lithuania opens up their arms to Jews who are fleeing, to the wealthy Jews who are fleeing from, or the Jews from money lending families who are fleeing to Eastern Europe. There was a question.
There had to be, my fourth picture, I saw very experienced because there was nowhere to go, there were no parties anywhere. Because as you said, like far away from each other, who would otherwise be able to? The peasants were really slaves to the land, they couldn't go anywhere. So they lived in the castle, down on money, couldn't spend it. And even though parents.
That is true.
So you have to do it to yourself. You have to create the feedback, so roofing and craftsmen, shoemaker.
Oh, okay, good. All right, good. So we're getting there. Okay, so here's a quick fact. By the early 19th century in Poland, approximately 85% of registered taverns were leased by Jews. Right now, this picture, right, which dates from the early 20th century, is of a Jewish tavern owner, a Jewish musician. That's not a Jew, right? Because non-Jews would come to the Jewish tavern to get their drinks, to live a little. Now, why are Jews so overrepresented in the taverns? Well, a tavern is a place you go to drink. To drink, you need, to make drink, to provide drink, you need grain, alcohol. Alcohol comes from grain, right? These are just subleases of subleases of subleases of your rent, right? So there's a Jew who owns, or maybe not, but probably a Jew owns the grain arenda, right? Who has subleased, right? The distillery who are subleased, right? The liquor who has subleased, either a chain of taverns or down to one tavern in this particular place, right, which this Jew is leasing from another Jew, who's leasing from another Jew, who's ultimately leasing from a noble. Okay. But as was said before, peasantry are not self-sufficient, right? Especially in a place where they are so, right, widespread as they are in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. These lands are so vast, and you need people out there, right, working those lands. These peasantry are not self-sufficient, right? They are not making their own. They don't have their own dairy, right? They're not making their own shoes. Right? They may be making some of their clothing themselves, but there's probably others which they need. They're not their own blacksmiths, right? They need services that they're to subsist, to exist, right? So what happens is small villages emerge, right, within these vast lands whose primary purpose is to service the peasantry. What's the number one service that peasantry need? Oh, no, not food. Even more important than food. God, right? They need a church, right? They need a church. They need someplace they can go on Sunday, right, to pray. Wherever they would go on Sunday to pray is where they would go to buy whatever they needed, right? So little villages emerge. Now, we just had a moment ago that many of these arrendators are Jews who were being welcomed in from Western Europe. Now, what does a Jew need in order to live? Okay, good. They need other Jews, right? They need a shul, so they need a rabbi. They need a shochet, right? They need a mikvah. Good. So where are they going to live? Well, along with an arrendator comes Jews who can service the arrendator, who can help make a minyan, right? Who can provide basic services. So the service villages of the peasantry have a different name in our lore. We call them, the shtetl, right? The shtetl's purpose was to service the peasantry. We have this image often of shtetlach, of being completely isolated from the non-Jewish world. That is not true at all. In fact, they were there to service the non-Jewish world. What is true is that very often a shtetl may be 20, 30, maybe even 50 or 60% Jewish, because they're the ones providing these services, and because they came there, because there is somebody who either who either leased out the entire area by a Jew, or certain industries in that area by a Jew, and so they're attracted there and they live there together. But in just about any shtetl you'd walk into, the largest structure, the massive structure in that shtetl would be church, for sure, right? Because that was its purpose. And on Sunday, as the peasantry comes in, the Jews would come out, right, to provide them the services, right, that they need. Within this burgeoning world that was so hospitable, right, to Jews, it fit, it worked, right, emerges multiple communities of Jews who now begin to interact with each other. And over time, those interactions become solidified, or there becomes a need for Jews to start thinking about their interests as a whole, right? Because there are perhaps dangers that emerge. There's perhaps issues that we want to solve on a more global fashion, or in a more on a countrywide fashion. And in a world that had very little central government, it actually made it quite easy for Jews to create their own centralized government of sorts. And by the year 1514, we have the emergence of what is known as the Vad Arba Artzos, which was a Jewish political entity that would meet generally about twice a year during the major fairs, right? First in Yaroslavl and then in Lublin, and they would get together to discuss administrative issues. Pidyon Shvuyim was often a large one, right? If there were Jews who had been taken captive and had been held ransom, they would get together as a community to try and release them. They would issue taxes on their Jewish communities in order to support the institutions that they need. Their chadarim, their rabbis, their mikvahs, their shochtim. There were now communal the people on communal payroll. Well, communal payroll had to come from somewhere. Right? They would also get together to discuss major issues of halacha that may have come up. You had both the administrative and the rabbinic piece at these get-togethers about artzos. They are, by the way, from 1623 to 1761. We have what was left was known as the Pinkas of the Vad Arba Artzos. We have the actual records, right, of what they discussed, right? Sometimes, coming out in halachic rulings, sometimes purely administrative rulings. They would decide, by the way, what Masechta was being learned, right? In the Chedarim in a particular year. And that would, of course, impact what industry? Exactly, the printing industry, right? So the Vad Arba Artzos very much, right, had almost control over what gets printed in Jewish printing houses in Eastern Europe. By 1623, Lithuania has its own Vad. The communities were just so large, right, known as the Vad Medinas Lita. These two Vadim, or certainly the Vad Arba Artzos, right, for almost 250 years, right? It is operating, right? 250 years is a long time, right? Operating as the communal body, political, right, and religious body of the Polish Jewish community. Good. Slight diversion for a moment, right? Because we're talking here about the migration that begins in the 12th and 13th century. By the beginning of the 16th century, we have the emergence of the Vad Arba Artzos. So we know that the community in Poland and Lithuania has reached a critical mass. It is the most flourishing Jewish community in the world at that time. The period is rich with our early Achronim, right? The Bach, the Sma, the Ramah, right? This is their world. Generally speaking, right? A high flourishing of Jewish literary output. Right? Literally, I mean Torah output comes in times of stability, times of political stability, generally, not always, but generally speaking. And so it was a good time for the Jews. Something else really critical happens, though, in the middle of the 16th century, not in Poland, right? In Israel. Right? And that is the emergence of the Ari, right? And the Kabbalah that we know today is Lurianic Kabbalah. Right? Kabbalah, which has obviously its roots far before the 16th century, gets solidified, gets articulated in a very particular way, right? In Tzfat, in this same time that this community is starting to grow. It benefits from the fact that the 15th century is also the invention of the printing press. Right? The first Jewish printing press comes at the end of the 15th century. So as these ideas are beginning to emerge in Tzfat, they begin, not very fast, but they begin to spread through much of the Jewish community. Good. Anybody know who that is? Or let's start with this. Do we know where this is? This is not Lithuania. Okay, very good. Yes. This is the city that our newscasters today call Kyiv, right? But we like to refer to it as Kiev, right? This is the central square of the old part of the city of Kiev. So in the central square, Sophia Square, is this monument to a man who is considered to be a Ukrainian hero, right? You find him on the 5, right? Parvinia, I don't know how you pronounce that. Note as well, that's his face. And yes, as was correctly noted, this is a man by the name of Bogdan Khmelnytsky. You can spell that last name 700 times, 700 different ways. Okay, Khmelnytsky. Khmelnytsky is largely responsible for disrupting what had been several centuries. And again, I just want us to consider that. Several centuries of relatively, as far as Jewish history goes, relatively good, stable, right, life for Jews in Poland. What happens? So Khmelnytsky is a Cossack. Cossacks, that's all another name that we have certain associations with for good reason, right? In our community. But the Cossacks were a group of native Ukrainians who lived in these lands, those are the steppes, right? They were largely nomadic. They prized their ability to move, their ability with horses, right? And they also prized their military ability, right? They were warriors. They were warriors who moved, who were nomadic. We talked about the growth of the Jewish community over the course of the 15th and 16th century in Poland. Well, the growth of the Jewish community is largely a result of the growth of the Polish nobility. When the Polish nobility does well, Jews do well. Right? When the Polish nobility don't do so well, as we're going to see, Jews don't do so well. Right? So what is happening over the course of the 15th and 16th century, right, 16th and early 17th century, is that your Polish nobility continues to push farther into these lands of the Ukraine to take over more of those lands for themselves. Not so different than what happens here in this country. Right, as we move toward the frontier, right, westward, the same thing is happening eastward in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, nobility taking more and more of the land for themselves. This becomes a great affront to the Cossack community who believe that this land is theirs, it is their homeland, it is the land that they've grown up in, and the land is extremely precious to them. Right, their ability to move around that land, right, and not to be in an agrarian society that's fixed is extremely important to them. And they are militant by nature. They consider themselves to be great warriors. So Bogdan Khmelnytsky is a leader of the Cossacks who raises a rebellion against the Polish nobility, who wants the Cossacks, these native Ukrainians, to fight back against these lords who they believe are taking their land. Now, that is today why he is seen as a great hero for Ukraine, right? Because he was a Ukrainian fighting against the Polish nobility, who were a different religion, right? Whose ethnicity was different, and they were fighting for the sake of Ukraine. Now, the problem was, it wasn't very easy to get to the Polish nobility. I mean, you can be as angry with them as you wanted, right? But they were a very, very small number. And they weren't exactly coming out to the fields to greet your Cossacks. So what happens instead? Well, there's the second best thing, right? What's the second best thing? You attack those who represent the Polish nobility. You attack those who are managing their lands, right? And that is the Jews. So Jews become very much the target, right, of much of Khmelnytsky's revolt. And as you can see, it spreads here. Now, I don't know if you can read these, but you're familiar with some of these names. This says Berdichev here. This says Mezhebaj, Tarnopol over here, Lvov, Brody, right? And all the way up here to this is Lubech, right? Kiev. That's as far as they will reach, right? Wreaking destruction, right? As they go. The numbers of Jews who died, right, over the course of this revolt, which starts in what year? 1648. Okay, excellent. Has been a matter of quite a bit of scholarly debate. What we know is that it was terrible. Right? There is no question about that. This is a firsthand account by Nathan Hanover in a work known as Yevhen Mitsula. Right? And he writes as follows: these persons died cruel and bitter deaths. Some were skinned alive and their flesh was thrown to the dogs. Some had their hands and limbs chopped off and their bodies thrown on the highway only to be trampled by wagons and crushed by horses. Some had wounds inflicted upon them and thrown on the street to die a slow death. They writhed in their blood until they breathed their last. Others were buried alive. The enemy slaughtered infants in the laps of their mothers. They were sliced into pieces like fish. They slashed the bellies of pregnant women, removed their infants, and tossed them in their faces. Some women had their bellies torn open and live cats placed in them. The bellies were then sewn up with live cats remaining within. They chopped off the hands of the victims so they would not be able to remove the cats from their bellies. Yeah, so people have looked at this, right, and compared it to what happens in the 20th century, right, and unfortunately noted that they weren't the first necessarily to. So what was the actual number? So over the course of 1648, 1649, probably about 30,000 Jews, right, died. To give you a sense of what that means, the city of Vilna, which was known as Yerushalayim, right, of Lithuania, in the beginning of the 18th century, there were 10,000 Jews in the city of Vilna, right? That was the biggest community in Lithuania, had 10,000 Jews, so about 30,000 Jews killed in this one year, 1648 to 1649. And it seems that over the course of the next few decades, there are a series of invasions and revolts, which often Jews get caught in the midst of, right? And by 1667, the number's up closer to 90,000, right? Perhaps even 100. It's devastating. Right? It's absolutely devastating to this community and brings to a crashing halt, at least according to many historians, right, what had been an incredibly vibrant several centuries. So, now, as you probably know, another extremely important event follows on the heels of the Khmelnytsky massacres in 1648 and 1649, which so this, you can just see the areas, right, which were affected by Khmelnytsky. But the event that I'm referring to is the emergence of a man by the name of Shabtai Tzvi. Right? This picture you have here on the right is a wood carving from 1666 in Amsterdam, showing Shabtai Tzvi, right, as a king. It says a Peret Tzvi at the top, right, with a line down here, right, describing Bias HaMashiach, right, what you can see down here is a circle, which represents the reinstatement of the Sanhedrin, of the Beis Din Hagadol. This was the coronation of Shabtai Tzvi as king of the Jews, as the arrival of the Mashiach in 1665. Now, the fact that this wood carving comes from Amsterdam tells us a lot, because Shabtai Tzvi lived in Turkey. But his emergence, and again, that would be a whole lecture on in and of itself, spreads like wildfire. The idea that in a world that had just been rocked, and it was still being rocked, right, by massacres, right, that this was all part of a plan. Right, this was the Gog Magog. This was the great, right, apocalypse that precedes the coming of the Mashiach. And here comes somebody, right, a Kabbalist from Turkey, who, I mean, he himself probably not a great scholar, but surrounded himself by new Kabbalistic scholars, who is now going to build on much of the ideas that were laid out by the Ari in Tzvat a century before. Namely, this idea of the Shviras HaKelim, the idea that in order to create the world, God had to remove himself from the physical world. We call that what? Tzimtzum, right? God had to contract in order to make space for us to exist, because otherwise it'd be all God. So God had to remove himself. And as God removed himself, metaphorically speaking, of course, and as God removes himself, some of that divinity that he's taking away, he places inside a kli, a vessel of some sort. The kli shatters as he's creating the world, and bits and pieces and sparks of divinity are now to be found throughout the world. And in order to get back to that redeemed state as God had envisioned it, it is now up to us, to human beings, to find those sparks, to redeem those sparks that are often surrounded by husks known as klipos. That becomes the great work of a Jew, right? Is to redeem those sparks of holiness that are here in this world. And ultimately, when we do so, we'll bring the Bias HaMashiach. These ideas are only becoming public in the 1560s in Tzfat, but there is print, so they're beginning to spread, right? And so here we are a century later, and Jews have just been massacred in numbers that haven't been seen again since the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash, and perhaps even earlier. So here comes a dynamic man, right, who understands, sees what's happening in the world, and believes truly that he has been put on this earth in order to redeem those sparks, in order to bring the Mashiach. He has Kabbalists in Israel, a man by the name of Nathan of Gaza in particular, right, who will go out and sort of lay out the theology behind this. And he will then begin to travel a bit. He will begin to do, he was a wonder worker. He would do things, and he did some things that were pretty audacious, like using the Shem HaMeforash when he would get an Aliyah, like marrying a Sefer Torah, believing that certain halachos no longer apply because it's already now in the throes of the messianic redemption. This begins to excite the Jewish people, right? As you can imagine, right? People who were desperate for something. Ultimately, in 1666, he is summoned by the Ottoman rulers, right? Charged with sedition, with treason. He's leading some sort of rebellion here, right? Of Jews, given the choice either to convert to Islam, right, or to die, and he ultimately chooses, right, to convert. So this comes from the memoirs of Blickel of Hamlin. Now, we talked before about a wood carving in Amsterdam. Blickel, by the way, just fascinating. She's one of the few Jewish women who leaves us something that gives us insight into the world of medieval or early modern Jewish women. Blickel is living in Germany. And this is what she described. She's a contemporary of Shabtai Tzvi, and this is what she described. About this time, people began to talk of Shabtai Tzvi. But woe unto us that we have sinned and never lived to see what we have heard and I believe. We all believed it, right? But we never lived to see what we heard. When I think of the repentance done by the young and old, my pen failed me, but the whole world knows it. O Lord of all worlds, hoping as we did that thou had shown compassion on Israel and redeemed us, we were like a woman who sits in labor and suffers mighty pangs and thinks once her suffering is over, she shall be blessed with a child. But it was only hearkening after a week. Imagine going through labor and they're not being a child at the end. So dear God and King, it befell unto us. Throughout the world, thy servants and children rend themselves with repentance, prayer, and charity. For 3 years, the beloved people of Israel sat in labor, but there came forth naught but wind. It was not enough that we were unworthy to behold the child for whom we had labored and in whom our hope was sure. We were left in the end abandoned. Still, my Lord and God, the people of Israel despair not. They trust. Let's go down, skip to the next line, the next paragraph. Our joy, when the letters arrived from Smyrna, is not to be told. We got these letters from Turkey talking about Shabtai Tzvi. Most of them were addressed to the Sephardim, who, as fast as they came, took to their synagogue, read them aloud, young and old, the Germans too, hastened to the Sephardic synagogue. The Sephardic youth came dressed in their best finery and decked in broad green silk ribbons, the gear of Shabtai Tzvi with timbrels and dances. They one and all trooped to the synagogue and they read the letters forth with joy, like the joy of the feast of the Simchas Beis HaShoeva. Many sold their houses and lands and all their possessions, for any day they hoped to be redeemed. My good father-in-law left his home in Hamel, right, abandoned his house and land and its gold, goodly furniture, and moved to Hildesheim. And he was sure, right, that this was going to happen. And in the end, it did. Or at least, according to most, it didn't. Right? Because as we probably know the story of Shabtai Tzvi, he will convert to Islam, but he hasn't given up on his aspirations, and he will work this conversion into his Kabbalistic theology, the idea being that he had to go over to the Sitra Achra, he had to go over to the other side in order to redeem the sparks of holiness that were still there, and he would come back eventually to lead the Jewish people, right, back to their land. And what happens as a result is that although there's basically two reactions, right? There is devastation by 1666 by many in the Jewish world who feel like they had this awful tragedy. And here came this great harbinger of redemption. Ultimately, right, they were disappointed. So many they're despairing. Others will believe that Shabtai Tzvi he was right, or he's still there, or he's coming back. Right? And even after he dies, some will continue to believe that in fact there was truth there. There was something there. By 1755, a man by the name of Jacob Frank will claim to be a reincarnation of Shabtai Tzvi. And he will gather a not so insignificant following around him. You can see, there we go. Just from this picture, this is the area in which Jacob Frank begins to have real influence throughout much of Poland. He was not somebody to be taken lightly, but it shows you that even 100 years after Shabtai Tzvi was death, the ideas of Sabbateanism still lived on in this world. Okay. One last major event, and with this we're going to close. So we talked about the beginnings of this community and the migration to Poland. We talked about the flourishing of Jewish life there, reflected in this incredible Vad Arba Artzos and Vad Medinas Lita. We talked about the beginnings of Luriat and Kabbalah, which happened in Tzfat, which ultimately will impact the teachings of Shabtai Tzvi. We talked about the beginning of the end, the Khmelnytsky massacres. The Khmelnytsky massacres also expose the great weakness of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which is it has no central government. It has no army. So as much as it flourished during its time, once Khmelnytsky showed that a bunch of Cossacks could wreak havoc on this country the way they did, it opens the country up for invasion from Sweden a number of times and from other bordering countries. It shows its weakness on display for all, and that's what will happen over the course of these next 100 years. Invasion after invasion, the Polish nobility begins to lose its wealth, its power. The stability that they had enjoyed for centuries has now gone. As the nobility loses its wealth and power, they begin to squeeze the Jews who work for them. And ultimately, the whole story from a Polish perspective, from the perspective of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, comes to an end by the end of the 18th century. Because beginning in 1772, Poland's bordering countries simply walk in and take their land for themselves. No blood, no fighting, there's nobody to fight. It begins in 1772. Russia takes this piece for themselves, Prussia takes this piece for themselves, and Austria takes this piece for themselves. 1793, Russia helps itself to another big chunk of land, and Prussia helps itself to another big piece of land. And in 1795, and they're obviously doing this in cahoots with one another, they take the rest of it. So if this is Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in 1772, that's the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in 1815. It's gone. Poland doesn't come back on the map until after World War I. And doesn't do so well for that either, But it's gone. It's absolutely gone. So the whole world that Jews had inhabited, is gone. The structure in which they had lived is gone. Russia, you know what the Jewish population of Russia was in 1771? Officially, 0. There probably were Jews living there, But officially, it was 0. By the end of the 19th century, well, even earlier, by the end of the 19th century, it's 1 million. Overnight, they go from 0 to hundreds of thousands, Why? Jews weren't moving to Russia. Russia was moving to the Jews, The whole area, the Perl of settlement, this area over here, all becomes Russian, by the end of the 18th century. So, where does that leave us? What does the outlook look like for Jews in this period, the middle to the end of the 18th century? Well, politically speaking, things are weak, both internally and externally. Externally, Poland is now open to invasion, Their weakness has been exposed. Internally, Polish nobility actually put an end to the Vad Arba Artzos in 1764. They will not allow them to convene anymore. They were trying to consolidate their power. They didn't want some foreign body, some body of Jews, being more powerful than them. So internally, their political strength has now been sapped. Socially, what happens? As a result of the squeeze on the Jewish community. So the gap between the wealthy, right, who some nobility will come to actually for help, for additional funds, and those who have nothing, right, becomes greater and greater. That gap between the wealthy and the poor becomes aligned with a gap between the rabbinic elite or the learned and the unlearned, right? Because the rich want to marry their daughters to the learned, right? And if you are learned, that is what you are aiming for. You want to live, you want to be able to support yourself. You're looking for a shidduch with somebody who has money. So the gap actually is not between rich and poor. It's really between the powerful, meaning either you have money or you have learning, and the powerless, those who have no money and or no learning. Religiously, what happens? Well, we've discussed this rise in Kabbalah and what is known as practical Kabbalah, which we'll speak a little bit more about next time, which is using Kabbalah for practical needs. But there's also a decline in rabbinic leadership, which is going to happen, right? When wealthy father-in-laws are buying rabbinic posts, right, for their children, or they are consolidating their power and determining who gets to be put into what position. And as we said before, anytime that there is political turmoil, the output and the quality of Torah scholarship tends to go down. And ultimately, right, religiously, we're still very much reeling, right, from a world that had high hopes that there was redemption in sight, to a world that now had to deal with an aftermath of either somebody who's got into hiding and being reincarnated, or somebody who had dashed their hopes completely. So that's the world, right, as we see it in the 18th century. Traditionally, historians, right, have given a rather grim picture of this world. There's a new book out, a new history of Hasidus, which argues that in fact it wasn't as grim as historians make it out to be. That much of the stability here, that they will actually recover more than has been noted in the past from the Khmelnytsky massacres. That there still was a lot of life to Polish Jewry, but it is important to understand that these are the various factors that at play as we get in to tell the rest of our story, right, which is going to look like this. In 1740, right on the heels, we're going to get the emergence of the Besh, the Baal Shem Tov, from which Hasidus comes. Just a few years later, the Vilna Gaon will reach his prime, coming back after having been in Gullus, secluding himself. We'll talk about that. Comes back and becomes a force in the community of Vilna. The first Cherem against the Chasidim will come out in 1772, right, the very same year that Poland begins to disintegrate, right, and the emergence of the yeshiva movement begins in 1803 in Volozhin. So these are the things we're going to talk about next time, right, as we get into part 2. Have a good night.